Rome broke everything it touched. Legions that had marched from the cold forests of Germania to the burning sands of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast to the banks of the Euphrates, had never truly met a wall they could not eventually bring down. Every enemy fell, every city capitulated, every king either bent the knee or was dragged in chains through the streets of Rome. And yet, deep in the Mesopotamian desert, a city of merchants and priests and warriors stood twice against the full fury of Roman imperial power and refused to fall. Not through luck, not through divine intervention, though the people of that city would have said otherwise, through geography, through architecture, through religious conviction, and through a political intelligence that Rome consistently underestimated. What does it take to stop the most powerful military machine the ancient world ever produced? If you are new to this channel, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving a comment below. It genuinely helps this channel keep producing serious, well-researched history documentaries, and it helps more viewers around the world discover this kind of work. The story of Hatra is not simply a story about a city that survived 2 Roman sieges. It is a story about what happens when trade, religion, and military genius fuse together in a single place at a single moment in history. It is a story about a kingdom that emerged from the margins of great empires and learned to play those empires against each other. It is a story about walls that held not just because they were thick, but because the people inside them believed with absolute certainty that their gods were watching over them. It is a story that begins in the dust and silence of the northern Arabian desert and ends in catastrophe, not at the hands of Rome, but from a direction that almost no one in the ancient world saw coming. By the time this story is over, you will understand not just how Hatra was built and how it fought and how it fell, but why it mattered, why Rome feared it, and why its ruins, even after centuries of neglect and deliberate destruction, still speak with a power that is difficult to explain in purely rational terms. To understand Hatra, you first need to understand the landscape it occupied. Northern Mesopotamia, the land between the great rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, was not the fertile river valley that most people picture when they think of ancient Iraq. The region around Hatra was something else entirely. It was semi-arid steppe, a flat and largely treeless expanse broken by shallow wadis, the dry riverbeds that filled briefly with water after seasonal rains. Summer temperatures climbed to extreme heights. Water was scarce. The nearest major rivers were far enough away that any army approaching Hatra would feel the desert long before it reached the walls. This was not an accident. The people who chose this location understood exactly what they were doing. Hatra sits roughly 180 kilometers southwest of the modern Iraqi city of Mosul, in what was historically known as the Jazira, the island, a term ancient geographers used for the broad upland plateau between the upper Tigris and Euphrates. The city sits at the center of a natural basin that collects rainwater and channels it toward a series of underground cisterns and surface reservoirs. The founders of Hatra identified this hydrological advantage and built their city to exploit it. In a region where water determined survival, controlling the water meant controlling the territory. The origins of Hatra as a settled place are somewhat difficult to pin down with precision. Historians and researchers working from archaeological evidence and ancient written sources generally agree that the site was occupied no later than the final centuries before Common Era, probably during the period of Seleucid influence over Mesopotamia, when the successors of Alexander the Great were trying to hold together a vast empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to Central Asia. Some evidence suggests the site may have been used even earlier, as a sacred space or a seasonal stopping point for nomadic and semi-nomadic groups moving across the steppe. But the city, as a recognizable urban center with walls and temples and a permanent population, belongs to the period roughly between the 1st century before Common Era and the 3rd century of the Common Era. The political context of Hatra's rise is inseparable from the story of the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were an Iranian dynasty that had displaced the Seleucids across Mesopotamia and Persia during the 2nd century, before Common Era, and they had built one of the most sophisticated empires of the ancient world. The Parthian system was not the tightly centralized model of the Roman Empire. It was looser, more federated, more willing to allow local rulers, client kings, and regional strongmen to operate with considerable autonomy as long as they acknowledged Parthian overlordship and contributed to the defense of the frontier. This system had weaknesses, but it also had a flexibility that Rome, with its rigid provincial administration, could never quite match. Hatra emerged within this Parthian system as a semi-autonomous city-state. Its rulers held the title of king, and later some of them used the title King of Kings, a deliberately ambitious phrase that echoed the supreme title of the Parthian monarchs themselves. Whether this was a genuine claim to sovereignty or a form of honorific flattery is debated among scholars. What is clear is that Hatra occupied a special position within the Parthian world. It was not a Parthian city in any ethnic sense. Its population was predominantly Arab, drawing from the tribal networks of northern Arabia and the Syrian steppe. Its culture was a remarkable fusion of Aramaic, Arabic, Parthian, and Hellenistic elements, all woven together in a way that was entirely its own. The city's wealth came from trade. Hatra sat at a crossroads of caravan routes that connected the Persian Gulf ports and the Mesopotamian river cities with the Mediterranean world and the Arabian interior. Merchants moving goods between the Parthian east and the Roman west passed through or near Hatra, and the city's rulers understood that controlling and taxing this movement was the foundation of their power. Spices, textiles, metals, slaves, and luxury goods all flowed through the region. The revenues from this commerce funded the temples, the walls, and the professional military garrison that made Hatra formidable. The religious life of Hatra was extraordinary and deeply connected to its political identity. At the center of the city stood a massive sacred precinct, a roughly circular enclosure containing a series of temples and ceremonial buildings that dominated the urban landscape. The chief deity of Hatra was Shamash, the sun god, a divine figure with deep roots in Mesopotamian religious tradition going back to the ancient Sumerians and Babylonians. But the Hetrine religious world was not limited to Shamash. The city also honored Atargatis, the great Syrian goddess, Nergal, the god of the underworld, Alat, the Arabian goddess often identified with Athena, and a range of other divine figures drawn from the many cultural traditions that intersected in this place. The temples were not merely places of worship. They were political statements. They were economic engines, drawing pilgrims from across the region and generating income through offerings, festivals, and the services that a major religious center required. The physical design of Hatra reflected this fusion of military necessity and religious purpose. The city was roughly circular, an unusual urban form that was not common in the ancient Near East. The outer wall was massive, running for nearly 10 kilometers in circumference, built of stone and reinforced with towers at regular intervals. Inside this outer wall, a second inner wall protected the sacred precinct and the most important civic buildings. The space between the two walls was not wasted. It served as a buffer zone, a killing ground where any enemy who breached the outer defenses would find themselves trapped and exposed. The towers on both walls were designed to allow defenders to project fire and missiles outward in overlapping arcs, eliminating blind spots and making direct assault extraordinarily costly. The streets of Hatra were laid out with a logic that balanced the organic growth of a living city with deliberate planning. Colonnaded avenues led toward the central precinct. Workshops, residences, and markets occupied the spaces between the major axes. Statues and inscriptions in Aramaic, the administrative and literary language of the city, stood at key points throughout the urban fabric. These inscriptions are among the most valuable historical sources we have for understanding Hatra, because they record the names of rulers, the construction of buildings, dedications to gods, and the social hierarchies of the community. They tell us, in the voices of the people themselves, something of what Hatra meant to those who lived and died within its walls. By the late 1st century of the Common Era, Hatra had grown into a city of considerable size and sophistication. Population estimates vary widely, as they always do for ancient cities where census records do not survive, but the scale of the archaeological remains suggests a permanent population of perhaps tens of thousands, swelled at times by traders, pilgrims, and seasonal visitors. The city had the infrastructure of a mature urban center, water management systems, paved roads, monumental architecture, and a complex social organization that included a ruling family, a priestly class, a merchant elite, and a military garrison drawn partly from local Arab tribal forces and partly from professional soldiers. The rulers of Hatra during this period were navigating a genuinely difficult political environment. To their west lay the Roman Empire, which had been pushing steadily eastward since the campaigns of Pompey in the 1st century before Common Era, and which had a chronic appetite for the wealth of Mesopotamia. To their east lay the Parthian Empire, which claimed nominal overlordship over the region, but which was periodically weakened by internal dynastic conflicts and frontier pressures from Central Asia. Hatra's rulers played these two giants with considerable skill, maintaining enough of a relationship with the Parthians to benefit from their protection, while avoiding the kind of direct subordination that would have stripped the city of its autonomy. The relationship with Rome was more complicated and ultimately more dangerous. Roman expansion into Mesopotamia was not a steady or inevitable process. It moved in waves, driven by individual emperors who saw the conquest of Parthia as the ultimate prize, the achievement that would surpass even the conquests of Julius Caesar or Augustus. The Emperor Trajan, who ruled from around 98 to 117 of the Common Era, came closer than any Roman leader before him to actually achieving this dream. His campaigns in Mesopotamia during 114 to 117 of the Common Era pushed Roman forces deep into territory that no Roman army had previously reached. He captured the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon. He sailed down the Tigris to the Persian Gulf. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Mesopotamia might become a Roman province. It was during this period of Roman aggression that Hatra first appears clearly in the historical record as a military power rather than simply a trading city. Trajan's campaigns brought Roman forces to the region around Hatra, and the city's response was to resist. The exact details of what happened are not entirely clear from the surviving sources, and historians disagree on some points, but the general picture is that Hatra refused to submit to Roman authority and that Roman forces, despite their overwhelming strength in open battle, found the city's defenses too formidable for a quick assault. Trajan himself may have approached the city, but a sustained siege was not attempted, partly because the Roman supply lines were already stretched to their limits, and partly because a general revolt was breaking out across the newly conquered Mesopotamian territories. Trajan was forced to withdraw, and he died in 117 of the Common Era before he could consolidate his eastern conquests. His successor Hadrian took a more realistic view of Roman imperial limits and withdrew from most of Trajan's Mesopotamian gains. The frontier was pulled back to the Euphrates, and Hatra found itself once again in the ambiguous space between the two empires, neither fully Roman nor fully Parthian, but drawing advantages from both relationships. The city continued to grow. The temples were expanded and elaborated. New inscriptions were carved, the walls were maintained and improved. The rulers of Hatra, whose names appear in the Aramaic inscriptions as a succession of kings with titles that blend Arab, Aramaic, and Parthian elements, presided over what appears to have been a period of genuine prosperity. The political landscape of the region shifted again in the late 2nd century of the Common Era, when the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus launched a new campaign against Parthia. Septimius Severus was a remarkable figure, born in the North African city of Leptis Magna, the first emperor from that part of the world, and a military commander of considerable energy and ambition. He defeated the Parthians, captured and sacked Ctesiphon for the second time in Roman history, and created two new Roman provinces in northern Mesopotamia. These conquests brought Roman power closer to Hatra than it had been since the time of Trajan, and they set the stage for the most dramatic episodes in the city's history. Septimius Severus besieged Hatra twice. The first siege took place around 198 of the Common Era, and the second around 199. These were not minor skirmishing operations. These were full-scale Roman siege campaigns involving multiple legions, sophisticated siege machinery, and the personal presence of the emperor himself. And both of them failed. The failure of these sieges is one of the most striking military episodes of the late Roman imperial period, and it deserves careful examination. The Roman army of the late 2nd century was the most technically advanced siege force in the ancient world. Roman engineers could build ramps, towers, battering rams, catapults, and ballistae with a speed and efficiency that no contemporary force could match. They had broken the walls of Jerusalem, they had taken Masada, they had reduced fortified cities across the empire with methodical precision. Against Hatra, their methods broke down. The reasons were multiple and interlocking. The desert geography was the first and most fundamental problem. Moving a large Roman army across the semi-arid steppe to Hatra required enormous logistical effort. Water was scarce along the approach routes, and feeding and watering tens of thousands of soldiers and their animals in that environment was a constant drain on Roman resources. The ancient sources, including the historian Cassius Dio, who wrote about these events, describe the Roman forces suffering from thirst, heat, and supply shortages even before they reached the walls. The walls themselves were the second problem. The stone fortifications of Hatra were not simply thick. They were designed with a sophisticated understanding of how Roman siege tactics worked. The circular plan of the city meant that Roman forces could not concentrate their assault on a single weak point without exposing themselves to fire from towers on either side. The inner wall provided a second line of defense that would have required a second complete siege operation even if the outer wall had been breached. The defenders had ample supplies of water from their cistern system, and they had stockpiled food and weapons in anticipation of exactly this kind of assault. The third problem was the defenders themselves. The Hattran garrison was not a passive force waiting to be overwhelmed. The city had a tradition of active defense, using sorties and counterattacks to disrupt Roman siege operations. The ancient sources describe the defenders using a substance that ancient writers called naphtha, a naturally occurring petroleum product found in the Mesopotamian region, to set fire to Roman siege equipment. Whether this was a systematic weapon or an opportunistic tactic is debated, but the effect was to deny the Romans the ability to bring their most powerful siege machinery close to the walls without risking catastrophic loss. The religious dimension of the defense should not be dismissed. The people of Hatra genuinely believed that Shamash and the other gods of their city were protecting them, and this belief had real military consequences. It sustained morale through the brutal conditions of a siege. It gave the defenders a psychological resilience that purely material calculations cannot fully explain. The priests of the great temple precinct were not passive bystanders during the sieges. They were active participants in the city's resistance, maintaining the rituals and the sacrifices that the community believed were essential to divine protection. When the Roman assaults failed, this belief was powerfully confirmed, and the city's confidence in its own divine protection grew stronger with each repulsed attack. Cassius Dio, writing about the Second Siege, records a remarkable detail. He describes Septimius Severus ordering a withdrawal after his forces had actually succeeded in breaching part of the outer wall, because his soldiers refused to advance through the gap. The reasons given in the sources vary, and historians have debated whether this reflects genuine military caution, a breakdown of discipline, or a later literary embellishment designed to explain an embarrassing failure. What is not disputed is that the Roman army, after two major campaigns, left Hatra unconquered. Septimius Severus, one of the most capable military emperors Rome ever produced, could not take the city. The aftermath of the failed sieges had significant consequences for Hatra's status and self-understanding. The city had proved, against the most powerful military force of its age, that it could not be taken by storm. This was not simply a military achievement. It was a theological one. The survival of Hatra confirmed, in the minds of its people and in the minds of the wider region, that the gods of Hatra were real and powerful. Pilgrims continued to come, trade continued to flow. The inscriptions carved in the years after the sieges have a confidence and a pride that is palpable even across the distance of 18 centuries. The political situation in which Hatra operated continued to evolve in the early 3rd century of the Common Era. The Parthian Empire, which had been the dominant power in the East for nearly 5 centuries, was entering its terminal crisis. Internal dynastic conflicts had weakened the central authority of the Arsacid dynasty, the ruling house of Parthia, and a new power was rising in the Iranian heartland. This was the Sasanian dynasty, based in the ancient Persian region of Fars, whose founder Ardashir I overthrew the last Parthian king around 224 of the Common Era and proclaimed the restoration of Persian imperial greatness. The Sasanian Empire was a very different kind of power from the Parthian one, where the Parthians had been relatively tolerant of local autonomy and cultural diversity. The Sasanians were ideologically committed to a more centralized authority, to Zoroastrian religious orthodoxy, and to the aggressive reassertion of Persian imperial power across the entire region. For Hatra, the rise of the Sasanians was an existential threat of a different kind from anything Rome had posed. Rome had tried to conquer Hatra through direct military assault and had failed. The Sasanians would approach the problem differently. They understood that Hatra's strength lay in its combination of physical fortifications, water supply, religious legitimacy, and the loyalty of its population. To overcome all of these at once required not just military force, but political manipulation, patience, and the exploitation of internal divisions. The rulers of Hatra in the early 3rd century were attempting to navigate between the collapsing Parthian world and the rising Sasanian power. Some inscriptions from this period suggest that Hatra's kings were trying to maintain their traditional independence, refusing to simply transfer their allegiance from the Arsacid Parthians to the Sasanian Persians. This was a courageous position but also a dangerous one. Sasanians, under their king Shapur I, were determined to bring all of Mesopotamia under their control, and a city that had successfully resisted Rome but now refused to acknowledge Sasanian authority was both a military obstacle and a political embarrassment. The fall of Hatra, which most scholars date to around 240 of the Common Era, though the exact year is debated, was the result of a siege by Shapur I's forces. Unlike the Roman sieges of the previous generation, this one succeeded. The reasons why are not entirely clear from the surviving sources, which are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. Some ancient accounts mention internal betrayal, a faction within the city that opened a gate or otherwise assisted the besiegers. Other accounts emphasize the sheer persistence and scale of the Sasanian military effort. Still others point to the possibility that Hatra's water supply was compromised either through drought or through deliberate Sasanian efforts to cut off the cistern systems. Later tradition, preserved in Arabic sources written many centuries after the events, developed a romantic story about the fall of Hatra that centers on a princess named Al-Nadira, or sometimes called Nadira, who supposedly fell in love with Shapur I and betrayed the city to him only to be killed by Shapur himself after the conquest, because he could not trust a woman who had betrayed her own people. Historians treat this story with considerable skepticism. It has the structure of a literary legend rather than a historical account, and it appears very late in the source tradition. But the persistence of this story across many centuries and many different cultural contexts suggests that the fall of Hatra, so unexpected given the city's previous record of resistance, demanded an explanation that pure military force could not provide. The legend of betrayal filled that explanatory gap. What is historically clear is that when Hatra fell, it fell completely. Shapur I did not simply incorporate the city into his empire as a functioning urban center. The city was destroyed. The population was killed or dispersed. The temples were desecrated or demolished. The great urban infrastructure that had taken centuries to build was reduced to rubble and ruin. This was not an accident or a byproduct of military operations. It was a deliberate act of erasure, a statement that a city which had defied imperial authority for so long would not be permitted to continue as a symbol of resistance. The destruction of Hatra was thorough enough that the city never recovered. Unlike many ancient cities that were destroyed and rebuilt, Hatra simply ceased to exist as a living urban community. The site was not reoccupied in any significant way. The ruins stood in the desert, slowly being covered by sand and dust, visited occasionally by travelers and nomads, but never rebuilt. This complete abandonment is itself historically significant. It suggests that the conditions that had made Hatra viable, the particular combination of trade routes, political circumstances, and religious significance, had disappeared along with the city itself. The Sasanian conquest did not just destroy the buildings, it destroyed the entire system that had sustained the city. The consequences of Hatra's fall rippled outward in ways that were not immediately obvious. The most immediate consequence was the removal of a significant buffer between Roman and Sasanian power in northern Mesopotamia. Hatra had functioned for much of its history as a kind of political shock absorber between the two great empires, a place that neither side fully controlled and that both sides found useful as a neutral trading point and a source of intelligence about the other's movements. With Hatra gone, the frontier between Rome and Persia became more direct and more contested. The wars between Rome and the Sasanian Empire in the middle 3rd century of the Common Era were among the most destructive in the ancient world, and the elimination of the Hatrine buffer zone was one of several factors that made these conflicts more intense. For the people of Hatra themselves, the consequences were catastrophic and permanent. The inscriptions stop. The temple rituals end. The caravan routes shift. The community that had maintained its identity and its independence for several centuries simply vanishes from the historical record. We do not know what happened to the survivors, whether they were enslaved, whether they dispersed into the surrounding desert communities, or whether some small remnant maintained a ghostly presence near the ruins. The silence of the sources after the fall is itself a form of testimony to the completeness of the destruction. The medium-term consequences for the broader region were also significant. The Sasanian victory over Hatra was part of a larger pattern of Sasanian expansion that would reshape the political and cultural landscape of the Near East for centuries. The Sasanian Empire, at its height, was a formidable power that challenged Rome and later the Eastern Roman Empire, which historians often call Byzantium, across a wide frontier. The religious and cultural policies of the Sasanians promoted Zoroastrianism and Persian cultural forms at the expense of the diverse syncretic traditions that had flourished under Parthian rule. Cities like Hatra, with their blend of Arab, Aramaic, Parthian, and Hellenistic elements, represented a cultural world that the Sasanian ideological project was, at least in part, designed to replace. The longer-term consequences extend into the Islamic period. When Arab Muslim armies swept through Mesopotamia in the 7th century of the Common Era, they encountered a region that had been shaped by centuries of Sasanian rule. The cultural memory of Hatra survived in fragmentary form in Arabic literary tradition, most notably in the stories about the city preserved by later medieval Arab historians and geographers. These writers knew Hatra as Al-Hadra, and they preserved a mixture of genuine historical memory and legendary elaboration. The story of the city's fall, with its themes of love, betrayal, and divine punishment, became a kind of moral tale about the dangers of disloyalty and the inevitable fate of those who resist the tide of history. The physical ruins of Hatra were not entirely forgotten during the medieval period, but they were not systematically studied. The site was known to exist, and travelers occasionally noted the presence of massive stone structures in the desert, but the identity of the ruins was not always clear to those who passed by. It was only in the modern period, beginning with European travelers and scholars in the 19th century of the Common Era, that serious attention was paid to identifying and documenting the remains. The first systematic archaeological work at Hatra began in the early 20th century of the Common Era, initially under Ottoman and then under Iraqi auspices. German scholars were among the first to document the site in any detail, and their work established the basic outlines of the city's layout and the importance of its inscriptions. After the establishment of the modern Iraqi state, the site was excavated and studied by Iraqi archaeologists over several decades, and their work produced a substantial body of knowledge about the city's history, architecture, and material culture. The results of this archaeological work were extraordinary. The excavations revealed not just the military architecture of the walls and towers, but the full complexity of the city's religious and civic life. The great temple precinct at the center of the city, known in scholarly literature as the Temenos, was found to contain a remarkable series of buildings, including a large central temple, smaller subsidiary shrines, and elaborate carved decorations that combined Parthian, Hellenistic, and local artistic traditions in a completely distinctive style. The sculptures found at Hatra, many of them now in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, represent some of the finest examples of Parthian period art ever discovered. The faces of Hatrine nobles, priests, and deities look out from these stone carvings with an intensity and a particularity that makes them feel genuinely human rather than merely decorative. The inscriptions found at the site, numbering in the hundreds, provided researchers with an unparalleled window into the social and political life of the city. They record the names of kings and their family members, the construction and dedication of temples and other buildings, the activities of merchants and craftsmen, the religious practices of the community, and the complex web of relationships between Hatra and the wider world. Scholars working on these texts have been able to reconstruct, at least in outline, the dynastic history of the city, the succession of its rulers, and the evolution of its political and religious institutions over several centuries. One of the most striking aspects of what the archaeological and epigraphic evidence reveals is the genuine cosmopolitanism of Hatrine society. The inscriptions are written primarily in Aramaic, but they contain personal names drawn from Arabic, Parthian, Greek, and other linguistic traditions. The religious iconography of the temples blends Mesopotamian, Iranian, Arabian, and Hellenistic elements with a confidence that suggests not confusion or syncretism born of weakness, but a deliberate and sophisticated cultural synthesis born of strength. Hatra was not a city that was overwhelmed by the cultures around it. It was a city that absorbed and transformed those cultures on its own terms. The architectural achievements of Hatra deserve particular attention because they represent one of the most important surviving examples of Parthian period monumental building in the entire ancient world. The Iwan, a large vaulted hall open on one side, which became one of the defining architectural forms of Islamic architecture across the entire Middle East and Central Asia, appears at Hatra in some of its earliest and most developed forms. The great Iwans of the Hatrine temple precinct, built of carefully cut stone with elaborate carved decorations, demonstrate a mastery of vaulted construction that influenced architectural traditions for more than 1,000 years after the city's destruction. When you look at the great mosques and palaces of the Islamic world, with their soaring vaulted halls and their ornate carved facades, you are looking at an architectural tradition whose roots run through Hatra. The military architecture of Hatra was equally innovative. The circular plan of the city, the double wall system, the carefully positioned towers, and the integration of the water supply system into the defensive scheme all represent a level of military engineering sophistication that goes well beyond simple brute force. Modern military historians who have studied the site have noted that the design of Hatra's defenses anticipates principles that would not be systematically articulated in European military theory until the medieval period. The people who built these walls were not following a template. They were solving specific problems with specific solutions, and they got the solutions right. The water management system of Hatra is perhaps the least visible but most important element of the city's infrastructure. The city sat in a region where rainfall was irregular and surface water was scarce. Yet it was able to sustain a large population and withstand prolonged sieges. The answer lay in an elaborate system of underground cisterns, surface reservoirs, and water channels that collected and stored rainwater and runoff from the surrounding terrain. Archaeological investigation has revealed the outlines of this system, though much of it remains to be fully documented. The capacity of the cisterns was large enough to sustain the city through extended dry periods, and this hydrological security was as important to Hatra's military resilience as any aspect of its walls or towers. The question of Hatra's relationship with Rome deserves a final, careful examination because it illuminates something important about how power works in contested frontier zones. Rome's failure to take Hatra was not simply a military failure, it was a failure of strategic imagination. The Romans consistently approached Hatra as a military problem to be solved by overwhelming force, and they consistently underestimated the degree to which the city's strength was rooted in factors that military force alone could not address. The water supply, the religious legitimacy, the community cohesion, the desert geography, all of these were elements of Hatra's power that Roman siege engines could not break. There is also a deeper irony in the Roman relationship with Hatra. The city that Rome could not conquer was in many ways a product of the same interconnected world that Roman power had helped to create. The trade routes that enriched Hatra depended on the stability of the Roman Mediterranean economy. The luxury goods that passed through Hatrine markets were destined for Roman consumers. The cultural influences that shaped Hatrine art and architecture included Hellenistic elements that ultimately derived from the Greek cultural world that Rome had absorbed and transmitted. Hatra was not Rome's enemy in any simple sense. It was Rome's competitor, its mirror image in some respects, a city that had built its own version of cosmopolitan urban civilization in the space between the empires and that had refused, with remarkable success, to be absorbed by either of them. The legacy of Hatra in the modern world is complicated by the city's tragic recent history. The ruins of Hatra were designated a World Heritage Site by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization in 1985 of the Common Era, in recognition of their outstanding universal value as a monument to the cultural synthesis of the ancient Near East. The site had been studied and partially restored by Iraqi archaeologists in the decades before the Gulf War, and it was considered one of the most important archaeological sites in Iraq. The wars and instability that afflicted Iraq from the 1990s onward had serious consequences for the site. The period of international sanctions and then the invasion of 2003 of the Common Era created conditions in which archaeological sites across Iraq were vulnerable to looting and neglect. Hatra suffered from these conditions, though its relative remoteness in the desert offered some protection compared to sites closer to major population centers. The most devastating blow came in the spring of 2015 of the Common Era, when fighters from the organization known as the Islamic State, which had seized control of large parts of northern Iraq the previous year, attacked the site of Hatra and systematically destroyed significant portions of its surviving architecture and sculpture. Video footage of the destruction, which the perpetrators themselves recorded and distributed, showed fighters using sledgehammers, power tools, and explosives to demolish statues, reliefs, and architectural elements that had survived for nearly 2,000 years. The faces of Hatrine nobles and deities, which had looked out from the walls of the temple precinct through the rise and fall of empires, were smashed into rubble in a matter of hours. The destruction of Hatra in 2015 was not simply an act of vandalism. It was a deliberate ideological statement, an attempt to erase a pre-Islamic past that the perpetrators regarded as incompatible with their vision of religious and cultural purity. The irony is profound. The people of ancient Hatra had resisted destruction by the Roman Empire, one of the most powerful military forces the world had ever seen. They had maintained their identity and their independence through centuries of pressure from great powers, and then, nearly 18 centuries after the city's fall, what the legions of Septimius Severus could not accomplish was accomplished by a small group of men with sledgehammers. The international response to the destruction was one of shock and grief. Archaeologists, historians, and cultural heritage organizations around the world condemned the attacks and called for the protection of the remaining ruins. When Iraqi forces, with international support, recaptured the region in 2017 of the Common Era, assessment teams were able to visit the site and document the extent of the damage. The reports were painful reading. Many of the most significant sculptures and architectural elements had been destroyed beyond recovery. Others had been damaged but retained enough of their form to be studied and, in some cases, partially restored. The story of what happened to Hatra in 2015 raises questions that go beyond the immediate horror of cultural destruction. It raises questions about why certain places and certain objects are targeted for destruction by those who seek to impose a new order on the world. The answer, in the case of Hatra, seems to be precisely the thing that makes the city historically significant: its cosmopolitanism, its synthesis of many traditions, its refusal to be reduced to a single cultural or religious identity. Hatra was, in its very nature, an argument against the kind of cultural and religious absolutism that drove its modern destroyers. The city had always been a place where Arab, Aramaic, Parthian, Greek, and Mesopotamian traditions met and merged, and produced something new. That synthesis was exactly what made it intolerable to those who believed that purity required the elimination of complexity. The ongoing work of scholars, archaeologists, and cultural heritage professionals to document, study, and where possible preserve the remains of Hatra is a form of resistance to this erasure. The inscriptions that were photographed and studied before the destruction preserve the voices of the Hatrian community in a form that cannot be smashed with a sledgehammer. The scholarship produced over more than a century of research gives us a picture of Hatra that is rich enough to understand what was lost. The sculptures that were removed to museums before the attacks, including the remarkable collection in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, continue to testify to the artistic and cultural achievement of the Hatrine community. There is also, in the ruins that remain, a resilience that is difficult to ignore. The great walls of Hatra, built to withstand Roman siege engines and Sasanian armies, have been damaged by modern destruction, but not entirely eliminated. The outlines of the city plan are still visible from the air. The foundations of the temples still stand in the desert. The cisterns that sustained the city through its sieges are still there beneath the surface. Hatra is wounded, but it is not gone. What can we learn from the full arc of Hatra's history, from its emergence as a trading city in the Parthian period, to its resistance of Rome, to its destruction by the Sasanians, to its rediscovery by modern scholarship, to its partial destruction in the 21st century? Several things stand out. First is the power of geography combined with intelligence. Hatra's founders chose their location with extraordinary care, identifying a place where the natural environment could be made to work in their favor. The desert that made life difficult was also the desert that made conquest difficult. The water that was scarce was also the water that the city had learned to collect and store more effectively than any army could replicate on the march. Geography is not destiny, but it is a resource, and the people of Hatra understood how to use it. The second is the power of cultural synthesis. Hatra's strength was not the strength of a pure or homogeneous culture. It was the strength of a community that had absorbed the best elements of many surrounding traditions and combined them into something that was distinctively its own. The architecture, the religion, the art, the language, the political institutions of Hatra all reflected this synthesis. And this synthesis was not a weakness or a confusion. It was a source of resilience, because a community with many cultural resources is better equipped to adapt to changing circumstances than one that has committed itself to a single rigid form. The third is the relationship between belief and resistance. The people of Hatra believed that their gods protected them, and this belief had real consequences for their behavior in crisis. It is easy for modern observers to dismiss religious conviction as a kind of illusion that has no practical effect on the material world. The history of Hatra suggests otherwise. The conviction that Shamash was watching over the city, that the rituals performed in the great temple precinct were maintaining a divine covenant of protection, gave the defenders of Hatra a psychological strength that their enemies consistently underestimated. Whether the gods were real or not, the belief in them was real, and that belief shaped decisions and sustained resistance in ways that purely material analysis cannot explain. The fourth lesson is about the limits of overwhelming force. Rome, at the height of its imperial power, could not take Hatra, the most sophisticated military machine of the ancient world, equipped with the best siege technology available, commanded by one of the most capable emperors in Roman history, failed twice against a desert city that was by any material measure far smaller and weaker than the empire attacking it. The lesson is not that defense always beats offense, or that walls always stop armies. The lesson is that power has limits, and that those limits are often found not in the strength of the attacker, but in the specific conditions, geographic, hydrological, psychological, and cultural of the place being attacked. Understanding those conditions is the beginning of wisdom, whether you are a Roman emperor planning a siege or a modern strategist planning an intervention. The fifth, and perhaps most haunting lesson, is about the fragility of what survives. Hatra resisted Rome. Hatra fell to the Sasanians. Hatra's ruins survived for nearly 18 centuries in the desert. And then, in the space of a few hours in 2015, a significant portion of what had survived was deliberately destroyed. The arc of Hatra's history is a reminder that survival is never permanent, that what is preserved is always the result of specific choices by specific people in specific circumstances, and that the forces that threaten cultural heritage are not always the ones that history has taught us to fear. Rome did not destroy Hatra's legacy. The Sasanians tried and largely succeeded in destroying the living city, but they could not destroy the memory. It was a different kind of force, operating under a different ideology, nearly 2,000 years later, that came closest to erasing what remained. And yet the story of Hatra is not finally a story of erasure. It is a story of persistence. The inscriptions survive. The scholarship survives. The architectural forms that Hatra helped to develop survive in the mosques and palaces of the Islamic world, in the vaulted halls and carved facades that trace their lineage back to the Iwans of the Hatrine temple precinct. The faces of the Hatrine nobles and priests, reproduced in thousands of photographs and scholarly publications, continue to look out at us with that same intense particularity that struck the archaeologists who first uncovered them. The city that refused to surrender to Rome has, in a sense, refused to surrender to time. The history of Hatra asks us to think carefully about what we mean when we talk about civilization. We tend to use that word for the large, the powerful, the well-documented, the politically dominant. We speak of Roman civilization, Persian civilization, Greek civilization, as though the smaller and less powerful communities that existed in the spaces between the great empires were somehow less civilized, less worthy of attention. Hatra's history is a corrective to that tendency. Here was a community that for several centuries maintained a level of cultural, artistic, architectural, and political achievement that was genuinely remarkable by any standard. It did so not by imitating the great powers around it, but by synthesizing their best elements and adding something distinctively its own. It did so in a difficult environment under constant pressure without the resources of a great empire behind it. And it did so with a confidence and a creativity that speaks across the centuries with unmistakable force. The desert fortress that Rome could not break was not merely a military achievement. It was a human achievement of a deeper and more lasting kind. It was proof that the will to maintain a community, to defend a way of life, to honor the gods and the dead and the living, can generate a strength that no empire, however powerful, can simply overcome by force. That is not a comfortable lesson for the powerful, but it is a true one. And Hatra's ruins, standing in the desert of northern Iraq, are its enduring testimony. If this story moved you or taught you something new, please leave a comment below and tell us what struck you most. Your engagement is not just appreciated, it is what makes it possible for this channel to keep producing serious, deeply researched history documentaries like this one. Subscribe if you have not already, because there are many more stories like this one waiting to be told, and explore the channel's history playlist to continue the journey through the ancient and medieval worlds that shape the civilization we live in today. The past is not finished with us, and we are not finished with it. There is one more dimension of Hatra's story that deserves careful attention before we close, and that is the question of how the city fits into the broader history of Arab political identity. Hatra is often described in scholarly literature as an Arab kingdom, and this description is accurate in an important sense. The ruling dynasty and the majority of the population were Arab, drawing from the tribal networks of northern Arabia and the Syrian steppe. The personal names preserved in the Aramaic inscriptions are predominantly Arabic in origin. The religious traditions of the city included distinctly Arabian divine figures alongside Mesopotamian and Iranian ones. In this respect, Hatra represents one of the earliest examples of an organized Arab political entity exercising genuine sovereignty in the ancient world. This matters because the history of Arab political organization before the rise of Islam in the 7th century of the Common Era is often poorly understood, even by people with a serious interest in Middle Eastern history. The dominant narrative tends to jump from the pre-Islamic tribal world directly to the Islamic conquests, as though nothing of political significance happened in between. Hatra's history complicates and enriches that narrative. Here was an Arab community that, centuries before the Prophet Muhammad was born, had built a walled city of tens of thousands of people, had developed a sophisticated religious and artistic culture, had maintained political independence against the greatest empires of the age, and had created architectural forms that would echo through the subsequent history of the entire region. Hatra was not a footnote to Arab history. It was one of its earliest and most impressive chapters. The connection between Hatra and the later Arab world is not merely symbolic. The trade networks that sustained Hatra were part of a broader Arabian commercial system that linked the incense-producing regions of southern Arabia, the caravan cities of the Hejaz and the Najdi, the port cities of the Persian Gulf, and the markets of Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean into a single interconnected economic web. This system was the material foundation on which Arab commercial culture was built, and it was already old and sophisticated by the time Hatra reached its peak. When the Islamic conquests of the 7th century of the Common Era swept through Mesopotamia and Persia, the Arab warriors and merchants who led those conquests were not entering an alien world. They were, in many respects, returning to a landscape that their ancestors had shaped and traversed for centuries. The religious traditions of Hatra also connect in complex and indirect ways to the later religious history of the region. The great goddess Alat, who was honored at Hatra and whose image appears in some of the most beautiful sculptures found at the site, was also worshipped across the Arabian Peninsula in the centuries before Islam. The Kaaba in Mecca, the central sanctuary of the Islamic world, had in the pre-Islamic period housed images of many Arabian deities, and Alat was among the most widely honored of them. The theological revolution of Islam, which swept away this polytheistic world and replaced it with a strict monotheism, did not simply emerge from nowhere. It emerged from within a religious landscape that included the kind of sophisticated divine plurality that Hatra so vividly exemplifies. Understanding that landscape helps us understand both what Islam rejected and what it preserved, transformed, and built upon. The scholarly study of Hatra is still very much a work in progress. Despite more than a century of archaeological investigation, large portions of the site remain unexcavated, and the destruction of recent years has created both new urgency and new obstacles for researchers. International teams working with Iraqi counterparts have been engaged in documentation and stabilization efforts using modern photographic and digital recording techniques to preserve as complete a record as possible of what survives. Three-dimensional scanning technology has been used to create digital models of surviving architectural elements, models that can preserve the geometry and surface detail of structures even if the physical remains are further damaged or lost. This kind of digital preservation is not a substitute for the physical reality of the ruins, but it is a genuine contribution to the long-term survival of Hatrine cultural heritage in a form that can be studied and shared. The inscriptions of Hatra continue to yield new insights as scholars apply new methods of analysis to the existing corpus of texts. Linguistic research on the Hatrine dialect of Aramaic has deepened our understanding of the relationship between Hatra and the broader Aramaic-speaking world of the ancient Near East. Onomastic studies, that is, the analysis of personal names, have shed light on the ethnic and cultural composition of the Hatrine population and on the social hierarchies that structured the community. Comparative studies placing Hatrine material culture alongside that of contemporary sites in Mesopotamia, Syria, and Iran have clarified the city's position within the wider cultural geography of the Parthian period. One area of ongoing scholarly debate concerns the precise nature of Hatra's political relationship with the Parthian Empire. The traditional view, based on the evidence of the inscriptions and the general political history of the period, is that Hatra was a semi-autonomous client state within the Parthian system, acknowledging nominal Parthian overlordship while exercising effective internal independence. Some more recent scholarship has questioned aspects of this picture, arguing that the relationship may have been more variable over time, with periods of closer integration into the Parthian imperial system, alternating with periods of greater independence. The evidence does not allow a definitive resolution of this question, but the debate itself is productive, because it forces us to think more carefully about what political relationships in the ancient world actually looked like in practice, beyond the formal categories of sovereign and subject that modern political vocabulary tends to impose. The question of Hatra's economic history is another area where much remains to be learned. The general picture of a city enriched by caravan trade is well established, but the details of how that trade was organized, who controlled it, how the revenues were distributed within the community, and how the economic system evolved over time are still imperfectly understood. Archaeological evidence for commercial activity at the site, including storage facilities, workshops, and market areas, has been identified but not yet fully analyzed. The potential for future research to illuminate these questions remains significant, assuming that conditions in the region eventually allow sustained archaeological work to resume. The story of Hatra, in all its dimensions, is ultimately a story about what human communities can achieve when they combine intelligence, belief, cultural openness, and the willingness to defend what they have built. It is a story about the interaction between the local and the global, between a single desert city and the vast imperial systems that surrounded it. It is a story about the relationship between physical survival and cultural memory, about how a place can be destroyed, and yet, through the persistence of scholarship and the power of the human need to understand the past, continue to speak and to matter. Hatra was, in its time, one of the most remarkable cities in the ancient world. Not the largest, not the most powerful, not the most famous, but in its specific combination of qualities, in the way it fused so many traditions into something distinctively its own, in the way it stood against forces that should have overwhelmed it, and in the way its legacy has persisted through destruction and neglect and deliberate erasure. It was extraordinary. The desert gave it life. The desert preserved its ruins. And the desert is still there, patient and indifferent, waiting for the scholars and the curious and the careful to come back and listen to what the stones still have to say. Power, no matter how absolute it appears in the moment, cannot silence every voice it tries to suppress. The legions of Septimius Severus marched away from Hatra's walls, having failed. The Sasanian conquerors who finally brought the city down could not destroy its memory. The modern ideologues who attacked its ruins with sledgehammers could not erase the knowledge that centuries of scholarship had already secured. What Hatra built, in stone and in culture, and in the long chain of human memory, has proved more durable than any of the forces that sought to end it. That is not a guarantee that history always vindicates the resilient or rewards the creative, but it is a reminder that the things human beings make with genuine conviction and genuine skill have a way of outlasting the power that tries to erase them. If this story has stayed with you, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Hatra or on any part of this story that surprised you, and like the video so that more viewers can find this work. This channel exists to tell serious, carefully researched history in a way that respects both the subject and the audience, and your support makes that possible. Browse the channel's other history documentaries and playlists because the ancient world is full of stories as remarkable as this one, and every one of them deserves to be told well.